Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. So today we discuss violence in Black liberation movements in the US. The question I'm asking myself is it possible to draw variable conceptual tools from the liberation movements in the 60s, especially from their ethics of violence? I would defend today that the notion of self-defense in the praxis of resistance shows us that nonviolence as a practice is not sustainable, as it demobilizes in the long run the Black masses. To support my position, I will review various ethics of violence in the 60s, focusing only on the principles and not on whether or not they provide the desirable outcomes. The history of Black Americans in the US is one of enduring fight for freedom. The morality of armed struggle was not called under question during the Middle Passage, and for the 400 years the Black people were enslaved. It is only in the 60s that liberation movements started to make a distinction between the morality of violent struggles and the morality of nonviolent struggles. Today, contemporary liberation movements have adopted nonviolence as a tactic. These movements are Black Lives Matter, Critical Resistance, Dream Defenders, More Mondays, and Gathering for Justice. But it is a practice that has its roots in the 60s civil rights movements. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Martin Luther King Jr., brought this adaptation of Gandhi's philosophy in the US Soul in the context of civil disobedience. I will briefly give you a description of this tactic, its rules, and its ethical justification. So, nonviolence is a tactic in the realm of direct action, such as sit-ins, marches, and boycotts, that one must do while enduring verbal and physical abuse from the police without resorting to retaliatory acts. The justification for this practice is that by offering forgiveness to the white people and extending a path to reconciliation, the social movement demonstrates agape, which is a divine order love, which is virtuous, of course. And the sacrifice and the undeserved suffering are also virtuous because of their redemptive, educational, and transformative value. And so the benefits of this type of tactic is that it is a happy medium between passivity in front of the injustice and violent action. So nonviolence allows Black people to prove themselves that they are capable of ingenuity, bravery, and sacrifice. Therefore, they will be able to overcome the feeling of inferiority and feel pride. Nonviolence offers a moral guide when the violence of the state becomes overwhelming. So Black people with that nonviolent practice are able to stay decent, dignified, and responsible people during the fight, since this practice does not contradict God's obligation to love everybody like brothers and sisters. But according to certain critics, nonviolence can destroy families, such as Cynthia Washington from SNCC testified. She said, "I was my mother's only child with some responsibility to go home in relatively one piece, and I decided that it would be an unforgivable sin to let someone kill my mother's only child without a fight." So Cynthia Washington used to be in a nonviolent movement, but she decided to quit that ethics because it doesn't even follow God's rules. And when faced with this type of objection, Martin Luther King has only consequentialist justification as a response. He would say that nonviolence still stays politically expedient. But for Black masses, it becomes very hard to justify how it is ethically acceptable to expose children to police dogs, just like Martin Luther King Jr. did during the Children's Crusade in 1963. And so to answer this type of objection, you have another ethics of violence in social movements in the 60s, which is defensive violence. So you have in the South, vigilante organizations who protect Black people from the Klan, and they are called NAACP Monroe at North Carolina, and you have also the Deacons for Defense. And in the north of the US, you have Black Panther Party, who form armed patrols to support Black people when they get arrested and harassed by the police. So the number one rule is if someone shoots at the Black Panther Party or any self-defense movement, they must shoot back. And the reason why, the justification is first the Constitution. So you have constitutional principle for Huey P. Newton, Malcolm X, and Robert F. Williams. They say that if the Constitution provides white people the right to defend themselves, this must be applicable to Black people too. They must have the right to defend themselves. And Malcolm X goes further. He says that to maintain a psychological balance, it is necessary to kill the police dogs when they attack you. Because he says, if you don't take this kind of stance, your little children will grow up and think shame. And so for Malcolm X, it is necessary to avoid shame because shame associated with powerlessness leads to the paralysis of political action. It is crippling. So over the generation, shame is crippling. So we have to avoid that shame infiltrate political consciousness. And so the benefits of this type of tactic is that, of course, it is a nice compromise between strict politics of nonviolence and chaotic riot. But for certain critics, there is some limits. Self-defense movements such as Deacons for Defense and Black Panther Party are called hypermasculine because, for example, for the Deacons for Defense, women are excluded from leadership positions. But it is different for the Black Panther Party because they have this international list perspective, which allows women in the movement to compare themselves to other women warriors in other parts of the world, such as Algeria and Vietnam. So that enables them to confront sexism in the movement and to overcome their fears. So this is why in 1969, you can see that 60% of the Black Panther Party were women. But there is also another limit of self-defense movements is that it is taxing for Black people. It is a psychological sacrifice because it requires to convert the subjectivity to a subjectivity of a warrior. And so they have to transcend whatever confines them to submission and passivity. But we can answer that it is also taxing for Black people to practice the nonviolent ethics because and nonviolent defenders are acutely aware of that. You have Charles Gerald, former SNCC member, who said, "It seems good sense then to suffer one last time that all may not have to suffer in the same way that all of us have. So for nonviolent activists, the only way they can defend this psychological sacrifice is to repeat that it is only momentary. But the problem is that over the generations, this argument crumbles because, of course, it is no longer momentary. And a last critique that you can make toward defensive violence is that if you keep fighting, you will realize that it can no longer be only reactionary. Just like a former Black Panther Party member, Doruba bin Wahad said. He said that on the ground, the group recognizes the situation they face in front of the violence of the state repression in forms of surveillance, infiltration, assassination of members by the FBI. So when you face that, you see that reactionary defensive violence can no longer be sufficient to fight for freedom. So the solution to this last critique would be retaliatory violence, which is another ethics of violence that you see in the 60s liberation movement. So you have revolutionary action movement who was infiltrated in existing social movements and trade unions. And what they do, they will do urban guerrilla warfare and mass rebellions. So what looks like chaotic riots is in fact rebellion. The difference is that they have target, they have a discipline, they have weapons. So there is some kind of order in this chaos. In the for example, you had revolutionary action movement in Harlem riot in July 1964 with Molotov cocktails and police fired by snipers in retaliation for the murder of a Black teenager. You also had the same event that happened in Watts in 1965. So it is a retaliatory violence mixed with revolutionary violence. And so revolutionary action movement was in Philadelphia, Cleveland, Chicago, New York, Boston, Detroit, San Francisco, Los Angeles. And the members must be disciplined. They must be loyal to the movement and the leaders. They must be trained in revolutionary internationalism. They must stay connected to the Black masses. They must be governed by a secret central committee, and this leadership would be protected by some guards, and the guards would purge counter-revolutionaries. And ex-soldiers should be active in that movement. And the justification for this ethics is the knowledge that is provided by the praxis of resistance. So with that knowledge, you have a political analysis that is transformed. So now you see that it is actually a war between the state and Black America. So it is a revolution. So the benefit of this ethics is, of course, that it is more in tune with the dialectic between Black America and the state, where the state has developed into the oppressive antithesis to nonviolent resistance. And also, another benefit is that it gives restoration of pride, dignity, honor after centuries of humiliation, and despite the ideology asserting Black people's inferiority. But of course, we can say that the limit is that this ethics is really dependent on a very specific political analysis, which is that the US is a white supremacy that exerts tyrannical power against Black people. But for retaliatory violence defenders such as Robert F. Williams, who used to be only a self-defense activist, after 400 years of oppression, this political analysis must be common sense to everybody at this point. So So what I try to do today is to show that when it comes to Black liberation in the long run in the US, a strict politics of nonviolence is not sustainable. All these ethics have pedagogical value, but only defensive and retaliatory violence stay connected to the praxis of resistance and the Black masses. So I suggest that contemporary Black liberation movement should consider secretly incorporating revolutionary elements such as revolutionary action movement in their political action. Consequently, they should provide them with more spiritual and financial support. Why? Because the ethics of revolutionary action provide direction, discipline, and ethics that help build a political consciousness likely to outlast generations. Thank you.